be here with you today. As was mentioned, a lot of content. Please note two things about our kind of housekeeping. One is that a copy of the slides will be made available to you as a PDF. And the reason I bring that up is on the slides, there are links. There's a source note to almost every page. And once you have it in PDF form, you can click that link and they'll bring you right to the research that kind of backstops anything I'm sharing with you. So we have a lot of material, as I said. We're going to move pretty quickly through the curriculum. Some points we're going to go through more quickly than others, and we're going to give you different resources to follow up and hopefully pursue some of these ideas on your own as well. But this is a real quick snapshot of where we're going. We're moving through some basic ideas of climate literacy. The reason we do that is because really there's an unevenness as we present this topic in terms of people's understanding and thoughts about climate. There's nothing in the program here today that's, I would suggest, intended to change your thoughts or feelings about climate. That's not our mission. Our mission is to talk about what is known from a scientific standpoint about the effects of climate change, especially heat, on behavioral health, and more specifically on disaster behavioral health. And as I said, all the material I share with you will share the scientific research that kind of coordinates with that. Now, you also know, if you've been in class with me before, I'm not going to be the guy who reads the slides to you. So I'm going to count on you to be kind of following along with that. Or, as I said, at your leisure, go back to the PDF and maybe look through this at a more leisurely pace. But in our hour and a half together, as I said, a lot to cover. So we're going to jump right in and get moving on this topic. As I said, I know there's a lot of strong feelings, very diverse feelings about the issue of climate change, ranging from absolute acceptance to outright denial, and all things in between. Climate change is affected primarily by physics, not by politics. It's not a red state, blue state sort of thing. If the temperature goes up, water expands, ocean levels rise. That's physics, all right? That's just at a molecular level. So it's not really subject to a lot, in my estimation, of our own unique opinion about this. As I said, I'm going to try to share with you what is known scientifically, not just about climate change, of course, but climate change and psychology, and then in terms of what it means to us as disaster behavioral health responders. If you've got a beef with anything I'm sharing with you here, I kind of understand that. I respect that. And on the last slides are my contact information. You could email me, you could call me. I'm happy to entertain any level of discussion about this. But because the curriculum is so tight, we're not going to have an opportunity for much debate during this program. I will try to budget some time at the end for some questions, comments, and different ideas as well. So our perspective in this program is that while there is a lot of information known about the physical effects of climate change on the land, on the sea, et cetera, less has been discussed, at least, about the effects on human behavior. And believe it or not, there's actually a very, very good, robust sort of literature that exists on this that has been talking for a few decades about the effects of heat and climate change on human behavior, but it really hasn't bubbled to the surface as it was into our domain, into the mental health field or human service field just yet. So I hope to share some of that with you. And of course, all of us thinking about what does this mean to us in our work. Now, obviously, some of this will have a direct meaning to you in your personal life as well. But our focus today will really be, what does this potentially mean to us in the behavioral health field? And more specifically, what might it mean to us as DRCCs or disaster behavioral health responders about how we adapt, how we change perhaps our approaches to everything we do based on the information I share with you today. So, as I said, when we think about the science behind this, one of the things that has changed greatly over the last several years really is in computational power, the ability for modeling. And today there's a whole branch of science that's known as attribution science, in which you will hear, and I know you're already hearing on the radio or reading in the newspapers, statements like, this storm was made 50% more likely because of climate change, or this storm was 30% more powerful because of climate change. So the way these kind of mathematical models work, these climate models work, have become much, much more precise. There's a much higher degree of confidence in them today. Example, research released yesterday suggested that the fires we're experiencing in Canada right now, where there's 1,050 known fires burning and only about a third of them are contained or controlled in any way, that the fire season they're having in Canada, which is a record fire season for them, has been made 50% more likely by climate change, particularly heat and drought, and 30% more intense by climate change. So those numbers that you hear thrown around really have to do with this concept of attribution science. And we'll point more to that and speak more about that over the next several moments. But we also know in the science that heat, especially, and climate change do distort human behavior. It is a threat multiplier. It exacerbates existing mental health problems. It can create new mental health problems. And we're going to get into the weeds about this in terms of some of the real acute risks that arise in the behavioral health domain associated with climate. So for me, this is really important stuff. I mean, you heard in my introduction, this is actually my 35th year doing this sort of work, working with New Jersey's disaster mental health programs. And I've been through, with a lot of you, some really interesting times, from 9/11 through pandemic, through all kinds of different events. This is a really, really significant challenge. It's really complex, and we, I think, need to be very knowledgeable and forward-leaning in terms of understanding the behavioral health consequences, and specifically behavioral health disaster-related issues. This today is thought to be probably one of the most really pressing challenges of our time. And you're going to hear this phrase a few times in the program, that experts in this area tell us that climate acts as a threat multiplier for a wide range of different behavioral health effects. And we'll get into that more in a few moments. You also know we're in a record-setting heat year right now. And you might not be thinking it's been too bad this summer by us. I mean, we've had some of that smoke drift down from Canada and so on. But we are in the beginning of an El Nino cycle, which means in the Northeast, typically cooler, wetter summers. And that's what we're having pretty much this summer. But parts of the country are baking. Parts of the world are experiencing absolute record-setting heat right now. In fact, we just had the hottest July on average in terms of global temperatures, and what scientists believe to be the last 125,000 years. So we are on a trend ticking upward in terms of heat. Examples of evidence of this, and there's going to be times where I'm going to jump off and on the screen if I'm blocking information for you. That's not a tech problem with your computer or mine. So I'm just going to get out of the way so you can see the slides. It's, of course, winter in the Southern Hemisphere right now. Some places are having record heat waves, 100 degrees in Argentina in the middle of the winter. Highest levels of temperature and ocean temperatures we've ever had on record in South Florida. Parts of the Keys pushing towards 102 degrees. Hot tubs are run at 107 degrees. So that gives you an idea what the ocean temperature feels like. Lowest levels of sea ice in Antarctica. As I said, highest temperatures in Alaska. We believe over this summer, 4/5 of the world population have been exposed to extreme heat events. This was yesterday's forecast, again, from the National Weather Service for the Midwest. These are the feel-like temperatures, but this is what's been going on in the Southwest and the middle part of the country for much of this year. And you could say, okay, it's the weather, we get the weather. But you'll understand in a few moments as we dig deeper, climate change is not necessarily just about the weather. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the key concepts, as I said, in climate literacy over the next several slides to set a baseline so that everything else I share with you kind of makes more sense. And one of the numbers you hear very often in climate change is this number of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And what they're referring to, as you hear this number, is 1.5 degrees Celsius. And you have to remember 1 degree Celsius is 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. 1 degree Celsius or 1.5 degrees is above pre-industrial times. So we think about that as being about 1880 here in the United States. So these are temperature rises on average, global temperatures over that 150 years or so from 1880 going forward. Now, the part of this where it becomes important to climate scientists is as you push towards 1.5 and beyond, you start to reach a number of really significant tipping points in which really significant changes start to happen on the Earth, and we start to see things, for example, meaningful to us, like more frequent and more intense disasters. This graphic was published by NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, as you know, last October 11th. And what it represented was this change from the 1980s to where we are today in the frequency of disasters. In the 1980s, and that's kind of when I started in this field in 1988 with New Jersey's disaster mental health programs, we were averaging about 18 major catastrophic events in the US each year. And they were referring to this as a $1 billion or more disaster. Now, obviously, these dollar figures have been adjusted over time for inflation, but today we're averaging 82 of those, as I said, compared to 18. Was once every 18 days back then. It's once every 18 days now, was once every 82 days in the 1980s. So you could see the frequency of these events. And just think about last weekend. You were coming off the heels of the wildfires in Maui, flooding in California and Nevada, with that storm coming on board. You were having the heat waves in the Midwest. These are just US things, and things going on like this all around the world. So we have had a very serious uptick in natural disasters, and in climate science, what they very often refer to as climate-fueled disasters. And what that phrase refers to is because of increased heat, primarily, the frequency, the severity, the intensity of these events, even the duration of these events may have been increased because perhaps the ground is drier, ocean water is warmer as storms come on shore, create greater conditions for, or more favorable conditions for things like wildfires, et cetera. So we have had this great uptick in frequency going from one catastrophic event every 82 days to now one every 18 days. Let me get out of the way again of this graphic. But I was speaking earlier about the idea of attribution science. So this today is kind of where we're getting a lot of this information about how these events are increasing in their frequency and severity, how much climate change plays a role or doesn't play a role. And climate change in general is not thought to be causal for most of these effects, but a really significant contributing factor that can aid to the seriousness or the severity of these events. So they're becoming more frequent. That should be interesting to us as disaster behavioral health responders. They're becoming more severe. That should be interesting to us as well. Now, every year, the Global World Economic Forum meets for their conference in Davos, Switzerland, kind of in January, February. In advance of that, they published the yearly Global Risk Report. This year's Global Risk Report, when it came out towards the very end of 2022, advance of 2023, 1,200 of the world's leading experts across a range of different disciplines suggested that in the 2-year and then the 10-year periods you see in this graphic, climate actually becomes the dominant sort of threat worldwide. These are the green bars on these graphics. More important to us is the idea that these experts believe that we're entering an era that will be defined as polycrises or polycrisis. And that's the idea of simultaneous overlapping disasters happening almost simultaneously. So if you think about Maui, the wildfires there, the flooding in Southern California, the heat wave in the central part of the state, these things happening simultaneously is a real strain on the system, on our population, a strain, for example, on FEMA, who already is pretty much run down their entire yearly budget for disaster response by July this year. This is, again, something very significant to us. So if we think about the kind of traumatic stress aspect of this, this is not necessarily individuals responding to a disaster anymore, but very much an ongoing stream of potential disasters in which very often people feel there's not an opportunity to really even catch their breath, never mind, recover fully from event to event. So we're actually just beginning to learn, as we have a good deal of knowledge about the physical effects, geologic effects of climate change, we're actually just beginning to learn fully about the psychological and behavioral effects as we see this all kind of move forward. So I want you to think about these effects in kind of three domains as we start, 2 or 3 domains, and we're going to get deeper into this, as I said. First of all, the direct sort of behavioral health impact. If you have gone through a fire, flood, earthquake, as we know as DRCCs, yeah, there's a significant number of people that are going to experience traumatic stress reactions, and a subset of those people who are likely to go on to develop post-traumatic stress disorders and other sorts of related conditions, having lived through the trauma and the threat of an actual disaster. There's also the indirect effects that happen kind of what we call downstream effects more slowly. So as we have temperature rise, we have sea level rise, and New Jersey is very vulnerable to this as a coastal state, as some of our counties being very low-lying, obviously all of our lakes, rivers, and streams as well. Water expands as it heats, so we have level rise. We have melting in different parts of the world. We have a number of things going on to contribute. The impact of drought and the likelihood of wildfires, as we have wildfires burning even here in New Jersey today. And then downstream effects, which we'll speak about later, things like eco-migration of people who may have to move out of different parts of a country or entirely out of a region because it becomes inhospitable, unlivable in that way, and literally people who are on the move for greener pastures. So a lot to think about. Now, these effects, these indirect and direct effects, they can be acute. They could be the sudden shocking event, like a storm coming on shore here in Jersey. We've all been there. We know this from Sandy and every other event of this type we've had. Wildfires, flooding, all the things that we are vulnerable to here in New Jersey. Those are sudden, they're shocking. They typically result in the sort of PTSD or PTSD-like reactions that we are very familiar with in the field of disaster mental health. And it's probably what our system as DRCCs is best set up to respond to, are people experiencing these sort of traumatic stress reactions to disasters. But there's also the possibility of very prolonged disasters. If you are someone who lives, again, in a coastal area, and we have the slow incremental increase in sea level rise, if you live along in agricultural areas, which are becoming more susceptible to drought or even to flooding and extreme precipitation events, all of these things are slow moving over a very prolonged period of time and equally stressful, both emotionally, and even financially for individuals, families, and communities there. And then one of the things we're going to get into in a little while are the actual physiological effects of temperature and heat. As temperature goes up, and we're going to talk about the studies and the science behind these statements in a few moments, suicide rates go up. 2022 was a record year in the United States for suicides. Suicide rates go up with heat. Psychiatric emergency admissions and hospitalizations increase in higher heat. We have an increase in interpersonal aggression and violence in high heat. And we have really deterioration in sleep and cognitive functioning in high heat. All of these things are very significant to us in the behavioral health field in general, and super important to us in disaster behavioral health. Now, there's actually some really good research that was released this summer that spoke about the mental health effects of wildfire smoke as a form of pollution. And when we had the experiences, and are likely to have this yet again this year, of smoke drift from the Canadian fires, we know that actually has a mental health consequence. It could have very significant neurodegenerative impacts on individuals. It can contribute to exacerbate depression, anxiety, psychotic disorders, bipolar disorders, and contribute to suicide. So whether it's the kind of particulate matter associated with wildfires, it is the greenhouse gases that are so often discussed in discussions of climate change, methane, carbon dioxide, and all of these also have a very direct psychological effect on individuals. And then, of course, as I said, we could look at this through 3 different lenses, which is we have a growing number of people struggling with what we could refer to as eco-anxiety, which is anticipatory. And sometimes it's even being referred to as pre-traumatic stress, where people are learning about this, maybe hearing some of the more doom and gloom discussion about climate change, in which they're thinking, life is hopeless. Younger people right now are very susceptible to this, and we'll speak more about that as well. And we need to be very thoughtful about that. But across the country, more and more people who are showing up at therapists' office to speak of what we will generally refer to as eco-anxiety. So it's future-oriented, anticipatory. We have the actual, impact of heat and climate change affecting people today around the country. And again, having those resulting behavioral changes. And then, of course, there's the potential for delayed onset, in which someone may not be responding to the fire, the flood today, but maybe, in the weeks, months to come. So that trauma could be sudden and acute, it could be chronic, it could be delayed, just like all other forms of kind of stress. And then we have actually some new terminology entering the field. Example, a word like solastalgia, which is a form of grief or loss associated with climate change. A loss of your place geographically, if you and your family have to leave that part of the country, where your people have been for decades or centuries, to sell the farm or have to leave the farm that's been in your family for generations, things of this nature. So we have a number of different sort of emotional reactions that are very, very tied to climate, some that are just emerging and entering kind of our field of awareness as behavioral health specialists as well. But we also know that climate, at least in the beginning, will have its most dire effects on vulnerable populations. If you already are in the margins in some way, socioeconomically struggling to get by for many different reasons, people who are dealing with those challenges day to day are likely to feel the effects of climate first and most severely. And these are at-risk populations you are already familiar with from other sorts of disasters. The very young, the very old, those people with different medical challenges, those people with different pre-existing mental health conditions and developmental conditions and such. So these individuals who are vulnerable in our community, at least at the beginning, become that much more vulnerable under the weight of climate change. And the reason I say at the beginning is, if you play these models out over a very long period of time, climate change has some of an equalizing effect that even if you are living in a high rise, a $10 million apartment in Manhattan, you're breathing that same smoke drifting down from Canada as everyone else who's out there. Maybe you can live in a nicer apartment where you have air filtration, things of this nature. Maybe on the warmest days, you have the very best air conditioning. But under the weight of climate, these things change over time that have very much an equalizing effect. So my overall invitation for you through this program as we start to dig in is for each of us to become climate informed. You are all keenly familiar with the expression of being trauma informed. And we know, because of the ubiquity of trauma, the prevalence of how many people have had traumatic experiences, it is likely, it is sensible to assume that some of the behavior we see from anyone on a given day in a specific situation may be driven or shaped in some way by their previous traumatic experiences. When we use the term climate informed, we go even beyond that. If we could say, for example, in trauma, 60 to 70%, for example, maybe of the population have prior traumatic experiences, 100% of people globally at some point will have these climate-related experiences. So therefore, it will be very sound to think at some point that climate can be playing a role in affecting how a person is thinking, communicating, or behaving. As I said, if we look at national prevalence data, this from the National Center for PTSD, 60% of men, 50% of women over their lifetime, at least one significant traumatic event. If we take, for example, the existing numbers right now of the influence of climate, we believe it's probably out at about 90%, 96% of the global population at the moment, pushing towards, eventually 100%. So it is important to us. If you ever thought being trauma informed was important to your work, it will be equally important for us over time to become practitioners who are climate informed. And there are many associations. There's branches of the American Psychological Association, American Psychiatric Association, and such, that right now are dedicating themselves to advancing climate-related mental health. So this is a push you will see coming not just from us in the Division of Mental Health and Addiction Services, but you'll see in our related disciplines in our fields, in our professional circles over time. Now, in all the ways that we know that there are, in fact, mental health consequences from climate change, where the research is strongest is in the area of the effects of heat. So the vast majority of what I share with you, going from this point forward, primarily will have to do with heat, some with precipitation, some with other effects, but primarily the effects of heat. So this is where the science is strongest. Now, remember again, as we get deeper into this discussion, nearly all the slides have a source listed at the bottom. I can't do it while we're in PowerPoint mode, but if you click on this as a PDF, it'll take you right to the journal article, right to the study, right to the textbook chapter that supports what I'm talking about on this slide. So very little of this presentation ought to be Steve's opinion. All this should be sharing what is known at the moment, where we believe we're going in terms of the behavioral effects of climate. Now, while floods are the most common form of disaster here, I mean Jersey, but also worldwide, heat events are actually the most deadly. We look at one last summer, we believe there were 60,000 deaths in Europe during the heat waves there. We've had these events in the US and the Pacific Northwest. We had them years ago in Chicago. This is something that we globally have an experience with. Heat waves are the most deadly form of disaster. We have not practiced that. We have not done that in disaster mental health work in New Jersey just yet. We're really good with storms and floods and other things of this nature. We need to start thinking about the effects of these potential heat emergencies as well. Scientists in this area have started to call the period between May and October the danger season because of the prevalence of these sort of climate-driven disasters that we're experiencing, these excessive periods of heat or of rain. You may have heard over the weekend, parts of California got a year's worth of rain over the course of something like 24 hours. So we're into an era of extremes. And heat, as I said, is the primary or the predominant feature, but this is also extreme precipitation, extremes in other forces as well. So like most of my programs, kind of the true launch pad for our discussion is Lewin's equation. And if you're not familiar, Dr. Kurt Lewin, thought to be the father of social psychology, had famously said that human behavior is a function of the interaction between a person and their environment. Big environment, everything that's going on around them, socially and politically, in the media as well, not just, of course, climate or weather, but this is very sensitive. Now, while we can't hope to know all of the people that we will encounter in any sort of emergency, we can say with a higher degree of confidence in what environments are we likely to see different behaviors. So keep that in mind, this ratio, or this formula rather, the equation as we go forward. Very quick block of climate literacy, again, to level the field, because I know everyone who comes to this presentation comes with different levels of understanding or experience thinking about climate change, as I said, and different feelings about it as well. So let's do some real basic work in climate literacy to kind of keep us moving forward, and then we'll kind of jump into the behavioral health aspects. FEMA, who is our constant partner, of course, in disaster mental health, whenever we have major events in New Jersey, through our crisis counseling programs, Hope and Healing, for example, sees climate change as a major priority for emergency managers. And again, using the same terminology, calls it a force multiplier, increasing the frequency, the severity, the intensity of storms, floods, drought, heat waves, things of this nature. In New Jersey, our government has been taking this very seriously as well. If we go back to 2021, this statement from Governor Murphy in New Jersey's climate change resilience strategy. Climate change, this is as per Governor Murphy, the single greatest long-term threat facing humanity and our state, given our unique geography, our vulnerability, uniquely vulnerable to the effects of climate change. The science here is clear. So you could read the full report. I put the tag here, as I said, where you can go and learn more about the governor's and New Jersey's position on this. Rutgers, in our state university, has dedicated a center to the study of climate change. We're looking at what it means to New Jersey's residents, to our economy. We, as I said, are particularly vulnerable to these effects. And you may or may not know that New Jersey is in fact the first state that has begun mandatory climate education in our K through 12 classrooms, climate infused curriculum, which means in every different subject, climate gets discussed. So perhaps in some math class, we may say, what is how do you quantify, how would you, kind of calculate the potential level of sea rise if the temperature was X or if the temperature is Y? What does it mean in terms of social studies? What does it mean in terms of physical education? So the question for us in terms of climate literacy becomes real simple. Are we as smart as our fifth graders? Do each of us know as much as the kids in school today about the effects of climate change? Now, the way climate change happens is very, very slowly, very incrementally. It very often, I've been using this expression for years, and I see a lot of people using it today. A good example from a line from Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises, speaking to someone about how they had gone bankrupt. And the character says, gradually, then all of a sudden. And climate change can have that effect where there's been very, very small incremental changes in temperature over centuries. And then literally kaboom, it seems like we hear nothing but climate change in the news anymore when we look at fires, floods, other events happening around the world. Now, climate change is not just about the weather. This is a really, really common misunderstanding. A lot of people get hung up on this with, how could we have a 2 below degrees 0 day in the middle of February if there's such a thing as climate change? How could we be having a polar vortex if there's global warming? So climate change is not about a given day. There's always going to be extremely hot days. There always will be extremely cold days. It's just that the extremes become more extreme. And again, likely become more frequent and more disruptive. But climate is about the long-term picture. It is not just the weather. Climate is global over a long period of time. Weather is one place at the moment. It's cloudy, it's raining, there's thunderstorms. So weather changes hour to hour, day by day. Climate, very slow, very progressive, a very, very long time to change. Climate change involves all of these systems as they interact with each other. It is the hydrosphere. Example, water temperature in the Florida Keys right now, pushing 102 degrees. Very, very significant to marine life, very significant to the atmosphere, really meaningful as Tropical Storm Franklin starts approaching, potentially the southern US later this week or early next week, as hurricanes pick up more water, more moisture when water temperature is very high. The atmosphere. So here's the discussion of greenhouse gases, of carbon dioxide or methane that form a layer of insulation and prevent heat from radiating back into space, holding it as a glass greenhouse would to grow flowers, holding it closer to the earth and heating our temperature. The cryosphere. So we hear talk about the ice sheets and the ice shelves potentially melting or breaking away from West Antarctica to Greenland, to places like this. So all of our frozen areas, including the permafrost, which is thawing right now, and there's a lot of potential consequences to that because we know the Arctic is actually heating at about 4 times faster than any other part of the globe. The biosphere. This is everything alive. This is from cows burping to the exchange in photosynthesis of oxygen and carbon dioxide in plants. It is every kind of living thing contributing to the biological effects of climate change. And then lastly, the lithosphere. So if the ground is baked hard and dry in places that have become arid, in places that are on their way to becoming deserts, one, they radiate more heat. 2, they don't absorb rain, these big flooding rains we have, such as we had in the Southwest this weekend. So flooding becomes more likely. All of these things interact with each other, as you can imagine, and that is what we refer to as the climate. The climate is not just the weather. Climate change, then, is this slow, gradual progression that has been happening. Climate change has always happened. It's always happened. There's some aspect that's secular. There's some aspects we could look at tree rings or ice core samples and know this has happened for a very, very long time. The problem today is it's happening much, much more quickly because of the contribution, we believe, of the greenhouse gases since the Industrial Revolution, primarily from burning fossil fuels. So this is where the discussion of oil and gas and such and coal becomes part of this equation. So as I said, just to kind of bring this back, finish up this discussion, just touching on some of the key points of climate literacy, and obviously you could study a lot more about this. This is a slow, gradual, global change in daily average temperatures. And this has been inching up over, as I said, decade by decade, advancing much more quickly than history would have told us it should, based on what we believe are these factors. So there are natural factors, natural causes, ranging from the angle of the Earth, which varies very slightly towards the sun, to other cyclical changes that are natural causes that create climate change. And then there are anthropogenic climate change causes, which are, of course, the man-made changes, human-caused changes, such as the greenhouse gases. These both combine. The cyclical things that happen have always happened to the Earth, they're still happening. But now on top of that, we have added a layer of stress to the atmosphere through our production of these greenhouse gases. So all the natural causes, as I said, ranging from orbital variation around the sun, solar flares, that's solar output, volcanoes, and even the wildfires we're having right now on Maui and in Canada that putting so much smoke and particulate matter into the air, they all change climate. They change reflectivity, how much heat is coming through, how much light is coming through. So there's all of these mechanisms that are from the outside, leaning on the planet that do create climate change. And then there are the anthropogenic causes, as I said, the human causes, which are very significant. The greenhouse gases you hear so much about, deforestation, whether it's to clear land for logging or agriculture, not just coal mining and burning coal, but the process of coal mining is super dirty, and all other forms of air pollution we create through industry, through manufacturing, through chemical processes, et cetera. But then there are what we refer to as the 4 pillars of modern life, things that we think we really can't do away with or do away with quickly because they're so important to our way of life today. Ammonia, and you're thinking ammonia as it relates to nitrates in fertilizer. We believe, again, speaking as the scientific community reflects, if we were to stop using nitrate-based fertilizers today, which are very damaging to the environment, famine would increase worldwide by about 40%. So we're not able to stop that on a dime. Plastics and microplastics, very damaging. And as you know, plastics are made out of petrochemicals, so more gas and oil. Steel, the process of making steel requires heating and burning coke, a form of coal or coal-like material, to an incredibly high temperature. It's a very dirty process. And the manufacturing of concrete creates tremendous pollution as well. So we really can't do away with the concrete and steel we need for our roads, our bridges, our buildings. We can't do away instantly with the plastics and with fertilizers we need to sustain our modern way of life. But these are very polluting and very damaging to, again, the greenhouse effect. So again, to wrap this up, kind of put this in perspective, move on to the psychology, and our concerns. The greenhouse effect, as I said, if you can envision a greenhouse full of, tropical flowers being grown, it's in this bubble to heat it up, keep it warm from the radiation of the sun. It traps the heat in the greenhouse. The gases that are emitted by the processes I mentioned, they trap heat. So carbon monoxide, methane, all these things. And from a scientific standpoint, again, these graphs from NASA, from NOAA, these are our major government sources. These are not quirky sources. You can see this direct correlation as the levels of carbon dioxide in our environment, our atmosphere, have increased over the decades from pre-industrial times, 1880, to the current time. You see the temperature climb right up alongside of that to where we are today, which is about 1.2 degrees above our pre-industrial temperature. Now, as I said, all of the links in the PDF are hot, and there's a link to this basic guide again, from NASA on climate science and climate literacy. And if you want to know more about that, there's a lot of sources out there for you. And honestly, I do advise you to find your own, not just the ones that I'm offering you. Find the things that speak to you in whatever language or lens that you look at this through, but learn as much as you can about climate, just the way our kids are in school today. Now, as all of that happens, there are effects on the planet. And then we're going to get into effects on health, behavioral health, and what it means to us as disaster mental health responders. And I'm not going to belabor these because, again, it could sound like an absolutely, doom and gloom presentation, but there are cascading effects known as tipping points that start to happen as we get out to 1.2, 1.5, and beyond degrees above Celsius degrees above pre-industrial times. And you could see changes in sea level ice, which is, as I said, a record low in Antarctica right now. Sea levels rising, which we know they are. As I said, heavy rainfalls. We've seen epic flooding in different parts of the world, extreme drought, the wildfires we're experiencing, and just this general rise in ambient temperature pretty much worldwide. As we see that, the effects are very foreseeable. If you are entering periods of high heat, not just the potential for more wildfire, but obviously for more drought. More drought means the inability to grow certain crops, where the crops have less nutritional value as they grow in high heat situations. All of this potentially contributes to economic instability, to poverty, and as you'll see by the end of the program, even to civil unrest, to terrorism, and to war. So these do have a potential cascading effect that's very significant to us, including the possibility of forcing mass migration, which has a whole set of downstream consequences as well. Yesterday was the 22nd, the day before, I guess, I took this snapshot. The source I use to track the temperature is from Cambridge, or Oxford University, rather. You could find it through this QR code. You could find it online, again, by using the link that I provided. You could see we're right now at 1.28 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial times. And scientists, again, for the longest time have been telling us that once we get and we stay beyond 1.5, all of those cascading effects that I mentioned become much more likely. This tipping point theory suggests two things. One, a lot of energy is needed to get us up and past the tipping point. That's the energy through all the different mechanisms I mentioned in climate literacy. But once we pass that, no additional energy is needed for us to enter what is referred to as a runaway state. And in the runaway state, some of these changes are irreversible, and they just, again, continue to cascade. So we are right now at about 1.2, pushing towards 1.3 Celsius in, this slow progression towards this major tipping point of 1.5. And we did pass it. We passed it briefly in June. It was the very first time in recorded history. There's obviously some numbers I've thrown out here today, which were from prehistory, like 125,000 years ago. And I mentioned the current temperature shift. But in recorded time, these are, as I said, the highest temperatures. And in June, we passed 1.5 for several days. The tipping point concept is based on the idea that we pass 1.5 and stay there for a year or more. This looks increasingly likely, and most of our climate scientists tell us that we're probably on a trajectory to move between 2 and 3 degrees above pre-industrial time by the end of this century. Now, again, without belaboring these points and sounding, completely doomeristic, you'll start to see what these significant tipping points are. Things like the melting of ice sheets and ice shelves in the Antarctic and in the Arctic area. You see coral reefs dying, as they are now in 102-degree temperatures in Florida. You see the potential, and lots of talk right now about collapse of ocean circulation patterns in the Atlantic. And one I mentioned earlier, which was the sudden thawing of permafrost in the Arctic regions as well. Now, beyond the effects of this on the geographic planet, there are the effects as well on human health. And from here, we're going to jump to behavioral health, and there to aggression and violence, just to lighten the mood and cheer things up a little bit. And then on to what can we do about this as disaster behavioral health responders? What's our thinking there? So as I mentioned, in the beginning of this, which is kind of where we think we are now, we expect these climate changes to actually have the most dire effects on, as I said, vulnerable populations and vulnerable communities. If you are forced to live down by the river, if you are forced to live in places that are, near polluting factories, obviously they have a day-to-day effect on your physical and your psychological wellness, and certainly to your medical health as well. From the standpoint of vulnerable populations, there are these 4 factors that make people that much more vulnerable. First is we have a higher risk of exposure, as I said, for socioeconomically disadvantaged groups, where people have to live, may have less, may actually be more dangerous places, more prone to flooding, more likely to encounter hazards and such. So people live in riskier places. The second is that given the level of exposure, people are more likely to incur climate-related damages, both psychological and physical. Number 3, these same individuals very often lack the same resources to cope or recover from these incidents. If you are a high net worth individual or family, your ability to move on to a new home or to rebuild a home may be much, much greater than someone who's living in the financial margins. And lastly, many more people in this socioeconomic bracket rely on the land for their work. They work in farming, they work in animal production and food production, they work in different fields and jobs that are going to be much more sensitive to climate change, possibly losing those jobs. So the 3 basic determinants that have to do with this vulnerability and the interface with climate: higher rates of exposure, greater degrees of sensitivity, less adaptive capacity, all means people will suffer greater effects, both physically and psychologically, as climate change advances. Now, I understand this is very small print on the slide at the moment. We're only going to touch on this slide for, as I said, for a moment or two. Please circle back to this in the PDF or go to some of the other sources for these materials. But here, let's kind of just go down the left column of this. We know that climate, again, especially through extreme heat, has very pronounced medical effects. And that's what we're talking about at the moment, is the medical effects of climate change. So we have heat stress, we have heat stroke, we have a number of conditions that are exacerbated by extreme heat. Outdoor air quality, as I said, from pollutants, from wildfire smoke, we know, again, have an effect on mental health. Flooding, obviously waterborne vectors, the damage done to your home, your property, but also the sorts of diseases that could be waterborne, we know are increasing around the world. Vector-borne, we're seeing mosquitoes now in the Northeast that are carrying malaria, that are carrying West Nile. That's not particularly new to us, West Nile, but they're carrying diseases that we typically have thought of as being tropical diseases. Those mosquitoes are pushing forward, farther and farther north, again, as heat expands. Like that, as I said, water-related infections, food-related infections, such as, again, food poisoning and other things in places where refrigeration is compromised. And you have to think beyond the structure of New Jersey and your county. You have to think about this globally, those parts of the world, the developing parts of the world that don't have access to consistent electric and such. And then mental health, which we're going to spend a good bit of time on over the next several slides, we know has devastating potential mental health effects, which is really the crux of what I want to share with you this morning. But I want to kind of, before we do, talk about one other health consequence. And I mentioned this earlier, which was the rate of thawing and of permafrost in the Arctic and subarctic area. We saw just about 2 weeks ago a report from scientists of a worm, a nematode, that was dormant, they believe, for more than 46,000 years in the permafrost, that as the permafrost defrosted, reanimates, comes back to life. The message here is, if worms such as this can remain, viable for 46,000 years in the soil, so then can bacteria, so can viruses that we have not seen as humanity in tens of thousands of years be awoken. So when we think about pandemics, when we think about different disease scenarios, there are potential diseases that humans have not been exposed to in tens of thousands of years that are likely to be introduced as these parts of the world defrost. How do they move? They move on birds who migrate. They move on animals who migrate. They move in some instances of humans who are exploring these areas. But this is the potential of thawing the permafrost. I get it, guys. None of this is happy to think about. I apologize that there's not like a kind of real cheerful, happy presentation to be had about the behavioral effects of climate change. I'd enjoy it much more. I know you would too. But it's really, really serious stuff, and it's important for us to get our heads around that. So with that in mind, let's move ahead in the curriculum and start to talk about what we came to learn today, the behavioral effects of climate change and what it means to us in disaster behavioral health response. A few things to think about. As I said, we just touched a little bit on the medical and physical health. Other things happen in the domain. One of my daughters, Chloe, just moved back from Phoenix prior to this summer. And Phoenix right now just endured 30 or 31 days of 110 degrees or more. If you were going to go out to exercise, you needed to be up at 4 or 5 in the morning, and still it was in the 90s, if not nearly 100 degrees. So physical activity outside, physical activity changes under extreme temperatures like this. Heat-related illnesses, we mentioned a few, allergies become more exacerbated, and then the potential of foodborne, waterborne, insect-borne diseases. We've touched base on that. As you can see, probably any one of these slides is like a class unto itself, if not a semester. So I know we are moving through the material quickly, and there's an awful lot to absorb. But let's get to our focus, behavioral health. We know that stress, anxiety, depression, and grief, and that sense of loss I referred to before with the term solastalgia, are more likely in these environments. We have the potential for greater social strains. If you think your family's arguing now around the Thanksgiving Day table, around issues like politics or, for example, migration, as climate advances and migration becomes even more challenging as people try to leave the global south and those warmer areas, these politics around it become, the politics and the socioeconomics become that much more inflamed. We're going to talk about the effects on specific mental health conditions and the effects on substance abuse over the next few slides, but we'll also touch base on the effects of community health, including a documented increase in interpersonal violence, a documented increase in violence and crime, increased social instability, and a decrease of community cohesion, unfortunately at a time when we're more likely to need it than ever before. So in a very general way, I'd like you to think about the mental health consequences of being in these 5 general buckets. All right, so at the lowest level, we have what we refer to as eco-anxiety. Eco-anxiety is people like you at the moment hearing this saying, oh my gosh, this is terrible. I'm not sure I should have taken this class today. It's going to ruin my whole day. But eco-anxiety is individuals who are thinking about all of this, not just what you're hearing from me today, what you're seeing in the news, what you're hearing, perhaps what your kids are bringing home from school in terms of their climate education. It is making people really nervous, especially younger people. And you're starting to hear, discussions like, I don't think I want to have kids. I don't think I want to bring children into a world that will have these challenges. I don't think I want to be a homeowner if there's the possibility of these sort of consequences, stuff like that are really affecting people. And we'll look at that more fully in a moment. Exacerbation of pre-existing mental health conditions. We'll dig in and explain as well, but some mental health conditions can have very substantial kind of elevations in their severity during climate change and during heat. Increased psychiatric emergencies. We'll talk about the science there in a few moments. And then, as I mentioned, if we have more by the number, more frequent, more severe, more intense disasters, fires, floods, etc., we have more people exposed to those, which are likely to have disaster-related mental health fallout, mental health problems. And lastly, kind of at a more significant level, kind of the increase in potential hostility and aggression and violent behavior to the companies, this as well. Remember again, trying to speak from the science standpoint, very little of this ought to be Steve's opinion. Please go again to the different sources when you get the slides. Look at what these studies say. So in general, adults and kids, Americans are becoming more concerned, more aware about climate change. As I said, I get it. There's still very significant political divide. I know last night at the Republican primaries or the debates, one or two of the speakers there outright denied that the climate change was happening, calling it a hoax. So I get this, depending on your perspective, perhaps even your politics, there's a great diversity of opinion about climate change and its seriousness. But little by little, American adults in general are becoming more aware and becoming more concerned. And this is very true in kids. It's very true in younger people, where we're seeing some of the highest rates of reports of sadness and depression, of fear, anxiety, of feelings of powerlessness and hopelessness about their future associated with what climate change will mean to them in their adult life. Now, this is one of the few slides where I'm going to touch on like most of the bullets, and then we'll go on to explain these more fully. We know that climate change can exacerbate a range of different existing mental health conditions, especially things like psychotic disorders. As I said, if you're involved with traumatic events, fires, floods, etc., there's the possibility of more disaster-related traumatic stress disorders. We know existing struggles with grief, anxiety, trauma, etc., can be exacerbated as well. We talked about that loss of place. We know this represents potentially a lot of disruption for people in their life for a number of reasons. And again, we're going to talk about what this means in psych emergencies and hospitals. One of the things I'd like to kind of invite you to think about as we move through the next several slides is kind of a rhetorical question, like, who else should hear this? Should our first responders hear this? Should our local leaders hear this? Should our members of the mental health community hear these next several slides? So as I jump into these, I want you, of course, to hear this, but I'd like you to think, who else? If I say to you, there's a possibility of more psychiatric emergencies during heat waves, does that affect our local hospital? I would say it does. Does it affect our law enforcement and our EMS people out in the field? You bet. So I want you to think back through with me. So obviously, just like all the other aspects of climate change, some groups have a higher risk profile or are more vulnerable, as I said. We know from a behavioral health standpoint, the very old, the very young, pregnant and postpartum women especially, people with pre-existing mental health conditions, people with socioeconomic disadvantages, first responder populations who are going into the more frequent disasters, et cetera, all could be at higher risk for some of these adverse mental health considerations. We know then, and look at the source from this. This is the American Psychiatric Association. These are the big scientific bodies in our field. People with behavioral health conditions, again, are at higher risk for poor physical and behavioral health due to extreme heat. Extreme heat amplifies. We used the term at the beginning of the program. It is a threat multiplier. This exacerbates pre-existing conditions. So that's one pocket of information to hold on to. If you have a population of X in the county of individuals with pre-existing mental health conditions, those conditions are likely to be made worse by extreme heat. Look at the map I showed you earlier in the presentation of the middle of the country right now in a major heat wave. People living in those regions with mental illnesses, which today are 1 out of 4 Americans, 26.4%, are likely to have their condition exacerbated by heat. That's important to us. Look at the sources again. This is JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, a study published in February 2022 from researchers at Boston University. A direct linear relationship. I'm going to jump ahead one slide and then jump back. Direct linear relationship between heat and admissions to psychiatric emergency departments. People showing up in the hospital for behavioral health emergencies. And as you'd imagine, you could see from the graph, on days of high heat, the number of these admissions and presentations to the hospital emergency department increase accordingly. What do we see there as per this report? Increase in complaints related to anxiety conditions, stress-related conditions, somatoform conditions, mood disorders, thought disorders, substance abuse disorders, and an increase in suicide risk and self-harm. This tends to be higher in men than women, according to this research, and it tends to primarily happen in the northern half of the country. So Northwest, Plains, Northern Plains, the Northeast. We think primarily because we in the North are less acclimated to these high heat conditions, probably feel those conditions more pronounced. But the other thing to notice, it was probably on the last slide, I believe, is that these conditions, in terms of the increase in psychiatric emergencies, tends to last between 2 and 4 days after the actual heat event. So if we're looking at a week-long heat dome, as we've just seen park itself for 31 days over Phoenix, now in the middle of the country, if this is over the Northeast and it's over New Jersey, we're looking at a week, 2 weeks of heat. That doesn't stop the psychiatric emergency aspect on the day the heat wave dissipates. It carries on for the next few days after. If you have individuals who are using different psychiatric medications, some of those medications become less effective in high heat. Some of those medications can have life-threatening sorts of consequences during heat waves as well. This is from SAMHSA, not Steve's opinion. I want to give you a really good example of this as well. 2 years ago in the summer, and we had a heat dome effect over the Pacific Northwest. This is a part of the country that's not used to high heat in general. Not a lot of people even have air conditioners in their homes and such up in Washington, in Oregon, and so forth. During this heat event in the summer of 2021, they had 134 deaths of individuals with schizophrenia over that week. And this was about 8% of all the deaths experienced, which was a significant number of the event. But the general population of individuals with schizophrenia in that area is about 1%. So it was 8 times higher in that instance of individuals with schizophrenia. When you have a heat dome effect, this is very substantial to us in the behavioral health field. Compared to days without the heat in the same time of year before, years before, you actually have a potential 3-fold increase in the risk of death of individuals with schizophrenia. That creates a whole nother level of concern for us in shelters, in emergency management, and psychiatric emergencies and such. So here again, this is a study published this year in the British Columbia Medical Journal looking at this heat event. And we've seen this again worldwide. The other thing that we know is there is a substantial possibility of increase in suicide risk associated with temperature change as well. They believe that between now and 2050, we're likely to see an additional 21,000 suicides over that time attributed to the increase in heat that would not otherwise happen based on these, again, mathematical models. So a very significant contributor to suicide risk in a time we're already experiencing a spike in suicide risk as well. Lastly, before we kind of change direction slightly, increases in substance abuse probably makes sense to you as it relates to increases in stress, exacerbating other mental health conditions, exacerbating social conditions. A number of different things are going on simultaneously in which we do likely see an increase in substance abuse. So this is all really significant to our mental health care system, our behavioral health care system, day to day, never mind just during disasters. We'll get to disasters over the next several moments. I did speak about, and remember where I'm coming from, the disaster and terrorism branch, not just the effects of heat and such on disaster-related mental health, but also the violence that's associated with terrorism, extremism, group violence, and so forth. Really, really interesting stuff. Now, one of the principal investigators in this area is Dr. Craig Anderson at the University of Iowa, Iowa State, rather. And Anderson, as he starts writing on this, and I'd really recommend his book, Climate Change and Human Behavior, which I'm going to give you a link to in a little while. It starts off with this statement. What struck me when I really started delving into this is how many of the risk factors for adulthood violence are going to become so much more common as a result of rapid climate change. So let me explain the models for this, of where this statement kind of comes from. First of all, historically, we know there is, again, this relationship between heat and interpersonal aggression. And it's a very straightforward sort of relationship. We know that heat challenges people in terms of emotional regulation. It challenges people in terms of cognition. It decreases problem solving, increases the likelihood of misreading other people's behavior around us as being hostile. It increases the availability of what we call hostile thoughts. So this goes back, some of this research, literally decades. Some of the earliest research in this area starts about the year about 2000, nearly 20, 25 years ago now. So you see relatively newer studies, 2020, 2021, again, looking at these relationships, this one in violent crime in Los Angeles as temperature increases. Same researchers again, we look at this estimation that if we see one single standard deviation increase in temperature, the risk of person-to-person interpersonal violence increases by about 2.5%, and the risk of group violence increases by about 11%. Now, the problem with this is when you look at the climate change models, you're talking about between 2 and 4 standard deviations of increase in temperature. So these numbers become much more meaningful to us, not just, well, 2% is, relatively low. This becomes 10% pretty easily. We also know there's relationships. And remember, you go back to these links. Every link again has its its research attached to it. Extreme weather, especially heat, does also increase rates of domestic violence and intimate partner violence. So violence across the entire spectrum of interpersonal violence and group violence potentially increases in these high heat areas. JAMA, again, the Journal of American Medical Association, in a recent study, found again an increase in 1 degree Celsius, contributing to about a 6.3% increase in domestic violence in those countries they studied. And this again was a global perspective. So very, very interesting to us. Now, this looks like just, a pretty wacky graphic. It's all over the place. We're going to break this down. I want to explain Dr. Anderson's kind of model here in the relationship of climate and violence. So let's break this apart a little bit, the climate change violence model. It begins with this idea that there are 3 routes represented on that graphic. 1 direct route, 2 indirect routes. The direct route is the individual route, the indirect or developmental, and group. So the first idea is we know there is a physiological effect on the human body, psychologically, neuropsychologically, of the effects of heat that contribute to aggression and violence, okay? When people are exposed to heat, science is very clear in this area, they become more aggressive, they act more violently. How does that work? Well, a number of things contribute to this. As I said, we've seen this going back decades in studies, this relationship of temperatures and violence. Highest assault rates peak on the days when temperature is highest. The other thing, as I said, is it starts to affect situational awareness and cognition, that people are more likely to engage in violence, less likely to try to avoid it or diffuse it. They're more likely to go to violence to solve the immediate problem. The same part of the brain that's involved in thermoregulation, controlling our body temperature, is the same part of the brain that affects emotional regulation. And when we are in high heat conditions, to survive, our body naturally diverts energy away from the brain to help cool our body, to protect our vital organs and so forth. What this means is higher cognitive functioning suffers, again, a loss as that energy is diverted away from the brain. The critical parts of the brain stem, that regulate vital signs, get protected. We sacrifice some of the higher cognitive functioning for cooling in extreme conditions. People who are hot then, because of this cognitive change, start to believe other people around them. This is not delusional. This is just a change in our risk perception of other people around them becoming more aggressive, which aids in the likelihood of conflict and even aggression. the ability, as I said, to perceive situational awareness changes. We become more reactive, we become more impulsive. All this can be associated with greater potential for violence. And we know that people have shifts in perception of risk and risk-taking behavior in high heat conditions as well. Now, without going completely into the weeds, a lot of this has to do with serotonin, particularly serotonin uptake. We know that that dopamine is implicated as well. The anatomical structures of the brain that seem to be implicated are hypothalamus and most of the limbic system, as I said. But we know serotonin signaling is greatly affected by high temperature in the body. It creates a level of dysfunction, and it creates then these behavioral consequences. The other thing we know is not the brain now, but the body reacts neurochemically at a neurohormonal level as well by producing more adrenaline. Adrenaline makes us more aggressive. So Dr. Anderson and others have come down in this place where they believe that we're actually somewhat predisposed, hardwired to become more aggressive in high heat conditions. So that's about the individual route. We have this physiological, neuropsychological sort of consequence to being in high heat conditions that can contribute to, remember, not cause, can contribute to the potential for more aggression and violence. Then we have the developmental route, in which, again, there's a number of studies to suggest that in these climate conditions, meaning, again, high heat, but drought and such, we have the potential for changes in neurodevelopment in prenatal conditions in young children, in which we believe we could actually begin to produce more violent-prone adults going forward. None of this particularly good news, as I said. So climate change has very, very significant impacts on child development. Some of this is at the nutritional level, if we're in parts of the world. And again, think about this globally. This is not just like, Jersey-centric, US-centric. As we have high heat conditions, harder to grow crops. The crops we grow can have a lower nutritional yield, which means you're not getting the same thing. All of that can degrade neurologic development in young people, starting prenatally and then obviously after birth. We also anticipate the effects of stress and adverse childhood events and trauma on young children. If you are in a country, you're in a place where you are geographically displaced because you have to migrate to, as I said, greener pastures. You're missing school. You have higher levels of stress in your household. If parents don't have the sort of income or financial assets, if there are more people out of work, if there are more people suffering those effects of mental illness or substance abuse or domestic violence that I mentioned, obviously all these can have potential adverse effects on child development. Some of those which are actually known to contribute to higher levels of adult criminality or violence. And then lastly, and I'll get out of the way here for a moment, the potential for more group violence. And this happens in a number of different ways, beginning with really feelings of anti-immigrant sentiment, the in-group versus the out-group. And here you see in this one study, 2014, a really significant possible of group conflict, 62% increase by 1 standard deviation increase in drought intensity. This is very much a key factor in the Syrian civil war over the last decade or so, when you think about how drought affected that part of the world. And to put it in kind of really clear terms, if you know about or look into the Dust Bowl years here in the United States, when the Okies, people from more of the Midwestern states or some of the Western states, experienced years of arid conditions in which they couldn't grow crops and started migrating west to California, they were met with aggression and violence. These were Americans moving to other states to survive. And this resulted in many instances, violence trying to push those people back, telling those Okies to go home. So we're not even talking about people crossing international borders. We're talking about people who could even be moving from one part of the US to another to find, as I said, places to work, places to live, places where conditions are hospitable. So we're referring to this in a very general way as eco-migration, which is, again, climate kind of inspired migration. to greener pastures. We already have, in many parts of the world and in many populations, even in the United States, very strong anti-immigrant sentiments. This is what we refer to as the out-group. This can refer in regard potentially to aggression and violence. And we have seen in some parts of the world towards refugees, certainly higher levels of stress for those people and those families as they try to escape, inhospitable sorts of environments. But really, we see increases in all levels of aggression from interpersonal to group. As the climate warms, more people will be really displaced. That's just the simple facts of it. Whether it has to do with living in coastal areas and having sea level rise, that's a significant risk in Jersey. The drought conditions, which lead to more wildfires in many instances, significant in most parts of North America and of course around the world. The flooding that we're experiencing, again, with higher levels of precipitation, will drive people to move away. That there's parts of the country today where people cannot buy insurance. The major insurance companies are pulling out of parts of Florida and California. You cannot get homeowners insurance anymore in fire-prone areas or flood-prone areas of those parts of the country. People will not be able to stay. So you have, both in the country and outside, eco-migration. Now, this graphic refers to a concept known as the human niche, those places where people can comfortably live. I don't mean you don't have hot days or cold days. I mean just where it's so oppressive that you can't live, you can't work, you can't grow crops, etc. We believe that even in the US, the population over time will continue to push to the north and towards the east. That's towards us. New Jersey, as you keenly know from your commute this morning, is the most densely populated state in the United States. People will continue to push in this direction. So we see, again, the movement of people worldwide. We see the movement of people in the United States, and we see people even in our part of the country where you will have increased eco-migration. For the people who live and work in those more desirable areas, more comfortable areas, this can be experienced as an invasion. This is people who are not native to our area, coming to compete for scarce resources, food, water, jobs, housing, all of these things, again, in which people may become competitive and become protective. So in these situations, meaning that this is happening globally already with people trying to escape parts of the country, and you see this constantly with boats sinking and boats, capsizing, in people trying to migrate from Northern Africa into Europe, and people, again, who die trying to cross the borders and get into, across the southern border of the United States. We see all of this happening already. We're likely to see this increase in terms of its seriousness over time. It is predicted, again, by the United Nations International Panel on Climate Change that by 2070, we think about a third of the world population will be on the move, about 1/5 of the Earth's surface becoming inhospitable as climate change advances. Now, not only does this result then in these challenges of people becoming protectionistic and defensive about, the incursion of migrants, but we know this also can lead to more large-scale conflict. As global temperatures increase, people become more competitive for what they perceive to be scarce resources, from food to water to jobs to housing to energy, etc., which leads to potential more conflict. This is happening today. This is happening in parts of North Central Africa. It's happening in Chad and in Mali. It's happening in Syria. It is happening in places where countries are weaponizing water against each other, restricting the flow of rivers downstream, controlling dams, weaponizing access to basic things, like I said, food and water. And you see this even with the on and off participation of Russia right now in the large grain deals with Ukraine during their conflict, during that military situation. We also then have the potential for increases in environmental extremism. And again, I know there are people in our audience and any audience I speak to of all different political belief systems. This occurs across the entire spectrum of extremism, from the far left to the far right. We have seen violence occur this year in the Cop City conflicts in Atlanta, in which people have been hurt and killed by environmental extremism. We've seen an increase in the use of aggression and violence. If you haven't seen it, something you might want to check out. It's streaming on some of the major streaming networks right now. The movie How to Blow Up a Pipeline would be a good example of kind of left-leaning eco-extremism. But we also have a very serious concern about right-leaning eco-extremism, which we're going to refer to more as the potential for eco-fascism. And we have a number of groups worldwide, and I actually just did a presentation last week on eco-fascism and eco-terrorism for the FBI and US Department of Homeland Security. We see a number of groups around the world, especially in Scandinavian countries and European countries, and some here in the States and Australia and Canada, increasingly involved in eco-fascist thought, which is the merger of white supremacist thought and environmental extremism. And I want to give you some very, very clear examples of this to just drive the point home. In 3 events that you will know of over the last few years, the perpetrator, the attacker, clearly indicated in their manifestos, their writing, their messaging, their online activity, that part of their motive for the attacks was this idea of eco-extremism or eco-fascism. This begins with the shooter in Christchurch, New Zealand, who attacked the 2 mosques there in spring of 2019. He actually drew inspiration both from the Unabomber and from Anders Breivik, the attacker in Oslo, Norway, and Utoya, Norway, in July 22nd, 2011. The shooter in the Walmart store in El Paso, Texas, also in 2019, a white nationalist attacking migrants. And part of his manifesto, he actually titled his manifesto, The Inconvenient Truth, the same title used by Vice President Gore decades ago, as he started speaking about climate change. And then most recently, the shooter in the Tops grocery store in Buffalo, New York, who was a white supremacist, again, a far right sort of extremist, but also writing the same messages that he believed this violence was necessary to protect the resources in his region from migrants and from minorities. This graphic is part of the kind of milieu of eco-extremists on this end of the spectrum. Help more bees, plant more trees, save the seas, shoot refugees. So these are individuals who espouse the use of extreme violence, one, to reduce population. So from a depopulation standpoint, this means killing people who are not like you. So this extreme xenophobic idea, but also for protecting critical resources for your own people. So that's in the realm of extremism. Extremism and terrorism are very similar. There are some real nuanced differences between them. But our center, one of our national centers for excellence in terrorism studies, is known as START. This is at the University of Maryland, the Center for the Study of Terrorism and Response to Terrorism, identifies these 3 key points in how heat and climate change can contribute to terrorism. A direct contributor, it could be an indirect contributor, an ideological driver, and it creates not just the conditions, but also the possibility of terrorist organizations exploiting people and motivating them. I'll give you 2 examples of this to put it in plain language. You may recall over the, probably about 2 months ago now, the floods in Vermont, right? So they had an epic rainstorm. This might have even been just a month or so ago, in which, again, a year's worth of work over the course of a day or so. Some of these groups, I refer to as the eco-fascist groups, showed up to help with cleanup, giving out food, being a help in the community, and then handing out cards with their QR codes to learn more about their group. Their group, which is known as PINE, is a group that is advocating for New England to leave the rest of the United States again and become a white ethno state. So they are all about just white supremacy in New England, but they'll show up at wildfires, floods, etc., as these militias helping the community, demonstrating or suggesting the government is not helping you, the government is weak, the government is not protecting you. We will join our cause. What does this mean then to us as DRCCs, as disaster behavioral health responders? Well, a lot if you sit down and think through where we've gone. And guys, as much as this is a lot of material in a short time, as much as it's really heavy and unhappy material to have to think about, the material I've shared with you is a very, very condensed version of all we really need to be thinking about and learning about. So I wanted to use this program today as an introduction to the concept. And as I said, hopefully you'll look at the slides and click on some of those links and look at some of the studies where you can learn more about all the concepts that I've laid out so far. But for us as responders, this informs everything we do, including things like your personal safety. This doesn't mean we don't go out and we don't respond anymore, but it means things change in this era of the climate shift. It means that we may have more people who are exposed to more frequent disasters, so more need for our services. It may mean the people who are in our shelters are struggling more with psychiatric emergencies or exacerbation of their pre-existing mental health conditions. It may mean greater attention to suicide risk or suicide prevention during these times of climate change or extreme heat. It may mean a lot to us that needs to, as I use the term, inform all of our decisions, how we provide our services, how we do it safely, how we do it effectively, how we structure our teams so we don't burn our folks out if we're responding to more frequent and more intense disasters. All this needs to be considered as we go forward, right? So the other thing that's really important is because we collectively, you individually, are a specialist, an expert in behavioral health, human services, social services, and so forth, it is important that you be a spokesperson, that if this resonates with you, you do some more of the research yourself, or you're already someone who's involved in these thoughts. We need to be those people in the larger community who add to the discussion the behavioral elements of this that other people are not necessarily hearing. I mean, there's a really good story on the front page of the New York Times, I think maybe 3 days ago or late last week even, and the title was Heat Singes the Mind as well as the Body. And it was about the mental health consequences of heat and of heat waves. So this is coming into the popular kind of sphere of consciousness that climate change and heat not only affects the land, affects crops and floods and things of this nature, it affects us psychologically. So there are going to be more people hopefully turning to us to say, hey, you're a behavioral health specialist. What do you know? What can you share about this? We should expect more frequent events, longer wildfire seasons that start earlier and later in the year if they end at all, more emergency declarations, presidential declarations, more simultaneously and overlapping sort of events. And this means we need to change our skills, we need to change the structures of our team, we need to change our safety approaches. We also need to be thinking about our own home and family. We learned this, of course, very acutely during the pandemic, that there's a very significant mental health consequence to public health emergencies, and we played a real significant role in that as well. Well, I mentioned a whole range of different public health consequences to climate change, which will potentially also necessitate mental health support. So we're going to be called on more likely for that as well. We also know from an aggression standpoint, there's a greater potential for civil unrest, for interpersonal violence, for that sort of anti-immigrant aggression that we spoke about, potentially in some parts of the world, maybe even food riots, water riots, things we have seen in the past and are more likely to see. But for you as an individual, you do have to think about what this even means to you, your home, your family, in terms of your preparedness, just to deal with this, Your preparedness as a disaster behavioral responder for your ability to go out and help others in our community as we're needed. And this is, ideas like person role conflict, your obligations to home and family as they pull against your obligations to your work and your profession. And we may be exposed to higher levels of both stress and even vicarious traumatic stress simply by hearing more and more powerful questions. So it's important for all of us to begin to prepare. The things we've always done in terms of having supplies and having kits, but also learning about climate, of being part of discussions in our communities, in our county, about what this will mean for all of our services and how we adapt. And it starts, as we've done today, by increasingly becoming a climate literate professional, learning about this in your own way through the resources you identify, and sharing your thoughts and your opinions, even though they might not be popular. Engage others in our field, become vocal, and where you feel motivated, support these kind of efforts as they're going on around us. And if we're called upon as experts, to be willing to share our information. I got to present this a month ago to the U.S. Department of Defense for the Uniformed Services University of Healthcare, where we teach military docs and nurses and providers of all different kinds. This information went out to 1,700 mental health care providers worldwide in our military system. Again, we have opportunities sometimes to share this with big audiences. But lastly, try to become visible. If this resonates with you, as you learn more, speak up, share your experiences, help people understand the connection between climate and health, climate and mental health. And we as systems need to increasingly think about what this will mean in disaster behavioral health response. So to wrap up, we know that climate change does have the potential to create more dangerous and disruptive disaster events. Just makes good sense. There's significant behavioral and psychological consequences, though, also associated in all phases of emergency and disaster management, preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation. And we need to start to slowly shift our systems and our individual ways of thinking to acclimate to this new reality. So I want to end similar to as I began by thanking you, not just for the chance to share this with you and for your attention for the last hour and a half, but for what I'm referring to as becoming a pioneer in disaster behavioral health, climate-informed thought, and hopefully sharing this with others. If you need to reach out to me, again, questions, comments, discussion, disagreement, you have all my information, take a screenshot, reach back out to your team, ask again for my information, but you can reach me by my state cell phone, my state email for more resources, more information, or as I said, to support or disagree with any of the information I've shared with you today. Rihanna, I'm going to turn it back over to you to close it out. Any farewell statements before we go?